The night Celestine's gown caught fire, three things happened that would change Ashford City forever. First, a prince who didn't believe in curses watched golden symbols appear on a woman's skin and realized his entire family history was a lie. Second, a secret that had been buried for over a century clawed its way to the surface, bringing with it questions no one was prepared to answer. And third, a young woman who thought she was being protected discovered she had been a prisoner her entire life. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let me take you back to where it all began, 6 months before the fire, before the truth, before everything fell apart and came together in the most unexpected way. In the heart of Ashford City, where glass towers kissed the clouds and old cobblestone streets whispered of centuries past, there lived a young woman who everyone noticed, but nobody truly knew. Her name was Celestine Ashford. She was 24 years old, and she had not shown her bare arms in 17 years. Not once. Not ever. While other young women in the city wore jeans and t-shirts, sundresses and sneakers, Celestine moved through the world draped in long, flowing gowns that belonged to another century. These weren't casual vintage finds from thrift stores or fashion statements meant to turn heads. These were elaborate creations, floor-length masterpieces with sleeves that covered her wrists, necklines that rose to her collarbone, and fabric embroidered with symbols that seemed to shift and shimmer when you looked at them too long. Some people called her eccentric. Others whispered she was hiding something terrible beneath all that cloth. A few romantics said she was simply elegant, a throwback to a more graceful time. But everyone, absolutely everyone, wondered why. The gowns were beautiful, there was no denying that. On Mondays, she might wear deep emerald green silk embroidered with what looked like flames in gold thread. On Thursdays, midnight blue velvet covered in silver moons that caught the light like they were glowing from within. On Saturdays at the farmer's market, pale rose cotton with white birds stitched across the bodice, so realistic you half expected them to take flight. Each gown was a work of art, and Celestine wore them with a grace that made it seem natural, as if she had been born in another era and simply refused to acknowledge that time had moved on without her. But if you looked closely, if you really paid attention, you'd notice something else. You'd notice that Celestine never touched the gowns casually, never adjusted them in that unconscious way people fidget with their clothes. You'd notice that when someone complimented her on them, her smile never quite reached her eyes. And you'd notice that she never, ever went anywhere without an older woman shadowing her steps, a silver-haired guardian who watched everything with eyes sharp as broken glass. That woman's name was Morgana, and she had been Celestine's guardian since Celestine was 7 years old, since the night her parents died in a car accident on the old bridge outside the city. An accident everyone said was tragic but straightforward, just bad weather and bad luck, though a few people muttered about how convenient it was that the Ashford family, already fallen from grace and stripped of their fortune generations ago, had finally been reduced to nothing but an orphan child and a pile of debts. Morgana appeared the day after the funeral, paid off every debt the family owed, and took Celestine under her wing with a devotion that seemed both tender and strangely urgent. She homeschooled the girl, taught her art and literature and history, and on Celestine's 8th birthday, she presented her with the first gown. "Your family has enemies," Morgana had said, kneeling down to look young Celestine in the eyes. "Powerful people who would hurt you if they knew who you really were. These gowns are special. They're woven with protection, with symbols that keep you hidden, keep you safe. As long as you wear them, nothing bad can touch you. Do you understand?" Celestine, 8 years old and terrified and desperate for anything that might make sense of her shattered world, had nodded. And she had been wearing the gowns every single day since. Now, 17 years later, she had built a life around them. She taught art classes at the community center, working with children from difficult backgrounds, helping them express emotions they didn't have words for. She volunteered at the public library on weekends, reshelving books and recommending stories to anyone who asked. She had a small circle of friends who accepted her eccentricity without question, and she had learned to navigate a modern world while dressed like she belonged in a Victorian novel. It wasn't the life she might have chosen if things had been different, but it was hers, and she had made peace with it. Or at least, she had convinced herself she had made peace with it, right up until the night of the Harrington Foundation Gala, when a man with green eyes and a smile that made her forget to breathe asked her why she wore such extraordinary gowns, and she realized she didn't actually know the answer. All she had was Morgana's explanation from when she was 8 years old. And for the first time in 17 years, Celestine found herself wondering if that explanation was enough. The man's name was Elias Harrington, and if Ashford City had royalty, his family was it. The Harringtons owned half the commercial real estate in the metropolitan area, sat on every important board, and their name was engraved on buildings, parks, and charitable foundations throughout the city. Elias was 28, heir to the Harrington Empire, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never had to question his place in the world. He was handsome in that polished, expensive way that came from good genetics and better tailoring, all sharp cheekbones and perfectly styled dark blonde hair, and suits that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He should have been insufferable. Everyone said so. But when he approached Celestine at the gala, when he stood in front of her and asked about her gown with genuine curiosity rather than mockery, when he looked at her like she was the most interesting person in the room, she felt something shift inside her chest. Something dangerous. Something that made her want to tell him the truth, even though she didn't know what the truth actually was. "It's beautiful," he had said, gesturing to her midnight gown with its silver moons. "Is it vintage? I've never seen anything like it." And Celestine, who had perfected the art of deflecting questions about her appearance, found herself saying, "It's a family heirloom. Very old. It's supposed to keep me safe." The words were out before she could stop them, and she watched his expression shift from polite interest to something deeper, something that looked almost like concern. "Safe from what?" he asked quietly, and Celestine realized she had no answer that would make sense to someone who lived in the normal world. The world where clothes were just clothes and curses were just stories and girls in long gowns were simply making fashion choices. Before she could respond, Morgana appeared at her elbow, as she always did when conversations ventured too close to dangerous territory. "We should go," Morgana said, her voice gentle but firm. "It's getting late." And Celestine, who had been obeying Morgana without question for 17 years, nodded and followed, leaving Elias Harrington standing alone in the ballroom with questions burning in his eyes and no way to answer them. But something had changed. Some door had opened that night. Some question had been asked that couldn't be unasked. Because the next week, Elias showed up at the coffee shop where Celestine spent her Saturday mornings. And the week after that, he volunteered at the community center where she taught. And slowly, carefully, like someone approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement, he built a bridge between them, one conversation at a time. He never pushed, never demanded explanations she wasn't ready to give, but his presence became a constant in her life, steady and patient and impossible to ignore. Celestine found herself looking forward to seeing him, found herself wearing her most beautiful gowns on days when she knew he'd be around, found herself wondering what it would be like to tell him everything, the fear and the confusion and the growing suspicion that something about her life didn't add up the way it should. She didn't know then that Elias was wondering the same things. She didn't know that he had started researching her family history, digging into old newspaper archives and property records, trying to understand why the Ashford name had disappeared from prominence 3 generations ago, and why this beautiful, mysterious woman wore gowns covered in symbols that looked less like decoration and more like warnings. And neither of them knew that Morgana was watching their growing connection with a mixture of dread and resignation, knowing that the moment she had been dreading for decades was finally approaching, the moment when all the carefully constructed lies would crumble and the truth would emerge, terrible and transformative and absolutely inevitable. Elias Harrington had built an empire on patience and strategy, on knowing when to wait and when to strike. But Celestine Ashford was unraveling every carefully honed instinct he possessed. 3 months after the gala, he found himself doing things that would have horrified his corporate board. Things like canceling million-dollar meetings to volunteer at a community center, like spending his lunch breaks at a coffee shop that served mediocre espresso, just because a woman in an emerald gown might walk through the door, like lying awake at night, trying to decode symbols embroidered on fabric he'd only seen for a few hours. His sister Amara noticed, of course. Amara noticed everything. "You're obsessed," she said one evening, barging into his office at Harrington Tower without knocking. "The gown girl has you completely derailed. Half the board thinks you're having a breakdown." Elias didn't look up from the old property deed he'd been studying. a document from 1893 that listed his great-great-grandfather's name next to the Ashford family holdings. "Her name is Celestine," he said quietly, "and I'm not obsessed. I'm curious." Amara laughed, sharp and disbelieving. "Curious? Elias, you've spent 3 months chasing a woman who wears vintage gowns and barely speaks to you. That's not curiosity. That's something else entirely." She leaned against his desk, her expression shifting from mockery to something more serious. "What is it about her?" "Really?" Elias finally looked up, and the words came out before he could stop them. "She's hiding something. Or someone's hiding something from her. Every time I get close to understanding, she pulls back, and that woman Morgana appears like a shadow and takes her away. It's not normal, Amara. None of it is normal." His sister's eyes narrowed. "You think she's in trouble?" He thought about the way Celestine held herself, like someone carrying a weight they couldn't put down. He thought about the guardedness in her eyes, the way she touched her gowns with something that looked less like affection and more like resignation. "I think she doesn't know she's in trouble," he said finally. "And that's what worries me most." Amara was silent for a long moment. Then she shook her head. "Be careful, big brother. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some people don't want to be saved." But Elias couldn't let it go. He increased his research, hiring a private investigator to dig into the Ashford family history, and what came back made his blood run cold. The car accident that killed Celestine's parents 17 years ago hadn't been investigated thoroughly. The police report was perfunctory, almost dismissive, as if someone had wanted the case closed quickly. The Ashford family's fall from prominence 3 generations earlier hadn't been gradual decline. It had been swift and brutal, orchestrated by accusations of witchcraft and corruption that appeared in newspapers for exactly 3 weeks before vanishing completely, as if someone had scrubbed the story from public record. And the property transfers, the ones that moved Ashford Holdings into Harrington hands, they had all been signed by a judge who retired immediately afterward and died mysteriously 6 months later. Coincidence piled on coincidence until the weight of it felt intentional, felt designed, felt like someone had been trying very hard to erase the Ashford family from history. And Celestine, the last Ashford, spent every day wrapped in gowns covered with symbols that looked less like fashion and more like warnings written in a language nobody spoke anymore. Elias made a decision. He would stop circling and ask directly. He invited Celestine to dinner, not at a restaurant where they might be seen and talked about, but at his family estate, in the private garden where his mother used to read to him before she died. It was a calculated risk, bringing her into Harrington territory, into the heart of the legacy he was beginning to suspect had destroyed hers. But it was also an offering, a gesture of trust, a way of saying I want you to see all of me, even the complicated parts. To his surprise, Celestine said yes. She arrived at sunset wearing a gown the color of dark wine, burgundy silk with black lace that made her look like a character from a Gothic novel. And when she stepped out of the car and looked up at the Harrington estate with its stone facade and manicured lawns, something flickered across her face. Not all. Something closer to recognition, or maybe grief. "Your home is beautiful," she said softly as he led her through the garden paths. "My mother used to tell me stories about houses like this. She said they held secrets in their walls, memories that never fade." They sat at a small table under a pergola covered in climbing roses, and for the first hour, they talked about safe things, books and art, and the children Celestine taught, who were starting to create work that took her breath away. But as the sky deepened to purple and stars began to pierce the darkness, Elias couldn't hold back any longer. "Celestine," he said, setting down his wine glass and leaning forward. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Why do you really wear those gowns?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Celestine's hand went to her throat, fingers brushing the high lace collar, and for a moment, Elias thought she would deflect again, would smile politely, and change the subject the way she always did. Instead, she took a shaky breath and said words that would change everything. "Because Morgana told me they keep me safe. Because I've been wearing them since I was 8 years old, and I don't know what would happen if I stopped. Because underneath these gowns, there are marks on my skin that I don't understand, marks that have been there as long as I can remember, and the gowns are the only thing that keeps them from burning." The confession came out in a rush, and Celestine looked as surprised by her own words as Elias felt hearing them. "Marks?" he said carefully. "What kind of marks?" She shook her head, tears beginning to gather in her eyes. I don't know. Morgana says they're birthmarks, that my family has always had them. But they don't look like any birthmarks I've ever seen. They look like writing, like symbols, and sometimes at night they glow, Elias. They actually glow, like there's light under my skin trying to get out. And the gowns, these beautiful gowns that everyone thinks are just eccentric fashion, they're the only thing that makes the burning stop, the only thing that makes me feel normal. Her voice broke on the last word. Elias felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Have you ever tried to find out what the symbols mean? Have you ever asked anyone besides Morgana? Celestine wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. How can I? What would I say? Hello. I have glowing marks on my body and I wear vintage gowns to hide them. Can you please explain my life to me? People would think I was insane. Maybe I am insane. Without thinking, Elias reached across the table and took her hand. Her fingers were ice cold despite the warm evening. You're not insane. And you're not alone anymore. Whatever this is, whatever's happening, we'll figure it out together. I promise you. Celestine looked at him with an expression that was equal parts hope and terror, and Elias realized that she had been carrying this secret for 17 years, had been living with fear and confusion and the constant weight of Morgana's cryptic warnings, with no one to share it with, no one to help her make sense of it. He wanted to pull her into his arms, wanted to promise that everything would be okay, wanted to be the kind of man who could fix this for her. But before he could say anything else, before he could ask the 100 questions burning in his mind, something happened that neither of them could have predicted. The hem of Celestine's gown, where it pooled on the ground near the table leg, began to smoke. Not metaphorically, actual smoke, thin tendrils rising from the burgundy fabric like something was burning it from underneath. Celestine gasped and looked down, and Elias watched in horror as tiny flames appeared, licking up the silk, consuming the embroidered symbols in seconds. He moved on instinct, grabbing the water pitcher from the table and dousing the flames before they could spread up her body. The fire died instantly, leaving the hem of the gown charred and ruined, and in the space where the fabric had burned away, Elias saw what Celestine had been hiding all these years. Her skin, from ankle to midcalf, was covered in marks that glowed with soft golden light. They weren't birthmarks. They were symbols, intricate and beautiful and utterly alien, flowing across her skin like living calligraphy in a language that predated anything Elias had ever seen. The symbols pulsed gently, as if responding to a heartbeat, and as he stared, unable to look away, he saw words forming in the patterns, saw meaning trying to emerge from the ancient script. Celestine made a sound like a wounded animal, scrambling to cover the exposed skin with her hands, but it was too late. Elias had seen, and from the edge of the garden, a voice cut through the darkness, sharp and commanding. Step away from her, Mr. Harrington. Right now. Morgana stood at the garden gate, her silver hair seeming to glow in the starlight, her expression harder than stone. She moved toward them with surprising speed for a woman her age, and when she reached Celestine, she knelt beside her, examining the burned gown and exposed marks with hands that shook slightly. We need to leave, she said to Celestine. Immediately. The seals are breaking. This shouldn't have happened for years yet, but somehow they're failing. Celestine grabbed Morgana's wrist, her voice desperate. What seals? What are you talking about? You said these were birthmarks. You said the gowns protected me from enemies, but you never said anything about seals or them breaking. What's happening to me? Morgana's face crumpled for just a moment, revealing something beneath the stern guardian exterior, something that looked like guilt and grief and terrible, terrible knowledge. She looked at Elias, then back at Celestine, and seemed to make a decision that cost her something precious. Get in the car, she said quietly. Both of you. If the seals are failing, if the truth is coming out whether I want it to or not, then you both need to know what's really been happening. You need to know what the gowns really are, what Celestine really is, and what your family did, Mr. Harrington, to set all of this in motion. She stood, helping Celestine to her feet, supporting her weight as the younger woman trembled. But I warn you both, once you know the truth, there's no unknowing it. Your lives, your families, everything you thought you understood about this city and your place in it, it's all about to change. Elias looked at Celestine, at the fear and confusion in her eyes, at the glowing marks on her skin that pulsed with light he couldn't explain, and he made his choice without hesitation. Then let's go, he said. Show us the truth. The drive to Morgana's house felt like descending into another world, each mile taking them further from the gleaming towers and manicured streets of modern Ashford City and deeper into neighborhoods that time had forgotten. Elias sat in the back seat of Morgana's ancient sedan, Celestine pressed against his side, her burned gown leaving traces of ash on the upholstery, the golden marks on her exposed skin still glowing faintly in the darkness. She hadn't spoken since they left the estate, and Elias could feel her trembling, could feel the fear radiating off her in waves. He kept his arm around her shoulders, a silent promise that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. Morgana drove with her eyes fixed on the road, her jaw set, and Elias noticed for the first time how old she looked, how the lines around her eyes seemed carved by more than just years, carved by secrets that had been eating her alive from the inside. When they finally pulled up to a narrow Victorian house with peeling gray paint and windows that reflected the streetlights like watching eyes, Morgana killed the engine and sat for a moment in silence before speaking. "What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible," she said, her voice rough. "You'll want to call me a liar, or insane, or both. But I need you to listen, really listen, because Celestine's life and possibly yours, Elias, depend on understanding the truth." She turned in her seat to look at them both. "Can you do that? Can you listen with open minds even when everything in you screams that what I'm saying can't be real?" Celestine found her voice, small and shaky. "Just tell us. Please. I've been living in confusion for 17 years. Whatever the truth is, it can't be worse than not knowing." Morgana's smile was sad and knowing. "Oh, child, you'd be surprised what truths can do." She got out of the car, and they followed her into the house, through the book-lined hallway that smelled of old paper and dried lavender, into the sitting room where a fire burned in the hearth despite the warm evening. Morgana poured 3 glasses of brandy with hands that were steadier than her voice, handed them out, and then settled into a chair that looked like it had held her weight through 1,000 difficult conversations. The firelight cast dancing shadows across her face, making her look ancient and young all at once, and when she began to speak, her voice carried the weight of a story that had been waiting decades to be told. "Celestine, everything I told you about your family was true, just not in the way you understood it. Your ancestors were powerful, they did have enemies, and they were destroyed by people who wanted what they had. But they weren't practitioners of dark magic, and you're not being hidden from enemies who want to hurt you. The truth is so much worse than that." She leaned forward, the firelight catching in her silver hair. "Your great-great-great-grandmother was a woman named Alara Ashford. She was brilliant, fierce, and she stood in the way of a man who would do anything to get what he wanted. That man was Harrison Harrington, Elias's great-great-grandfather." Elias felt ice water flood his veins. What did he do? Morgana's eyes met his, and in them he saw judgment and pity in equal measure. "He wanted the land your family owned, Celestine. The most valuable property in Ashford City, the land that would become the foundation of the Harrington Empire. Alara refused to sell, so Harrison destroyed her. He fabricated accusations of witchcraft, bribed judges, turned the entire city against the Ashford family until they had no choice but to flee or be arrested. And as they dragged Alara away in chains, as they tore her from her children and her home, she spoke words that would haunt both families for generations." Celestine's glass slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor but not breaking, brandy soaking into the old rug. "What words?" Morgana stood and walked to the fire, staring into the flames as if reading the past in their dance. She said, "You steal my family's future, Harrison Harrington, so I curse yours. When a son of your blood reaches manhood, when he stands ready to claim all you have stolen, a woman will rise. She will carry my blood, and she will have the power to tear down everything you built. No walls will contain her. No lies will bind her. And love will be the key that destroys you." The words seemed to echo in the quiet room, filling every corner with their weight. Elias shook his head. "That's just a curse, just words spoken in anger. It doesn't mean anything." Morgana turned to face him, and her expression was grim. "That's what your family told themselves for 3 generations. Just words. Just the ravings of a desperate woman. Until your grandfather's time, when a young woman with Ashford blood appeared in his life, and within 6 months, the Harrington Empire nearly collapsed. Unexplained disasters, betrayals, financial ruin that took decades to recover from. Your grandmother, Eleanor, watched her husband almost lose everything, and she started asking questions. She dug into the family history, found Alara's curse, and realized it wasn't metaphor. It was prophecy. Elias stood abruptly, pacing to the window, his mind racing. This is insane. You're talking about magic, about curses that actually work. That's not how the world operates. But even as he said it, he was thinking about the glowing marks on Celestine's skin, the gown that had caught fire for no reason, the way his entire life had seemed to shift the moment he met her. Morgana's voice was patient but relentless. I'm not talking about fantasy, Mr. Harrington. I'm talking about belief made manifest, about words spoken with such conviction that they shape reality. Call it magic, call it quantum probability, call it whatever makes it acceptable to your rational mind. But Alara's curse was real, and Eleanor knew it. So she did what powerful people do when they're afraid. She found a way to cheat fate. She turned to Celestine, and the guilt in her expression was raw enough to hurt. That's where I come in, child. And that's where the gowns enter the story. Celestine had gone pale, her hands clutching the arms of her chair. Tell me. Morgana took a shaky breath. Eleanor found me 30 years ago when I was young and desperate and needed money to survive. She told me about the curse, about the prophecy, and she offered me a fortune to do one thing. Become your guardian when the time came, and make sure you never became the weapon Alara intended. The room seemed to tilt. Celestine made a sound like all the air had been knocked from her lungs. My parents. The accident. Morgana's eyes filled with tears that she refused to let fall. They discovered what Eleanor had planned. They found the gowns she'd commissioned, found the symbols woven into them, understood what they were designed to do. They were going to run, take you somewhere Eleanor could never find you, let you grow up free. Eleanor couldn't allow that. The words hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Elias felt rage building in his chest, hot and righteous. Are you saying my grandmother murdered Celestine's parents? Morgana met his gaze without flinching. I'm saying powerful people make terrible choices to protect what they think is theirs. The accident was ruled an accident. No investigation, no questions. And I showed up the next day to claim custody of a 7-year-old girl, armed with legal documents Eleanor had prepared months in advance. Celestine stood on shaking legs, her voice barely above a whisper. And the gowns? What do they do? Morgana moved toward her slowly, as if approaching something fragile that might shatter. They suppress you, Celestine. The symbols woven into every thread, their seals designed to keep the power in your bloodline dormant. As long as you wore them, as long as the magic in those threads stayed intact, whatever Alara passed down through the generations stayed locked inside you, sleeping, harmless. Celestine looked down at her ruined gown, at the golden marks glowing on her exposed skin, and understanding crashed over her features like a wave. You've been keeping me prisoner. For 17 years, you've been keeping me caged, and I never even knew it. Morgana's voice broke. I convinced myself I was protecting you, that if your power woke, if the curse activated, you'd be destroyed by it. That keeping you contained was kindness. But the truth is, I was protecting the Harringtons. I was protecting their empire, their legacy, their stolen wealth. And I was doing it with your freedom as the price. The silence that followed was absolute and terrible. Then Celestine spoke, her voice cold and hard in a way Elias had never heard before. The marks on my skin. What are they? Morgana walked to the bookshelf and pulled down an ancient leather journal, the same one she'd shown Elias parts of earlier. She opened it to a page covered in symbols that matched the ones glowing on Celestine's skin. They're Alara's words. The full curse, written in a language older than English, inscribed on her descendants' skin through blood and belief and sheer force of will. Every Ashford child born after Alara carried them, but they were dormant, powerless, until the conditions were met. A Harrington son reaching maturity, an Ashford daughter crossing his path, and love. She looked between them. The curse was never about destruction for destruction's sake. It was about justice through transformation. If the Harrington heir chose power over love, the curse would consume him. But if he chose love over everything his family had built, if he was willing to give up what was stolen and return it to its rightful line, then both families could be free. Elias felt the ground shifting beneath him again, felt every certainty he'd built his life on crumbling. So Celestine isn't dangerous. She's a test. The curse is testing me. Morgana shook her head. The curse is offering a choice. But make no mistake, Celestine is very dangerous now that the seals are breaking. The power waking inside her. She doesn't know how to control it, doesn't understand what it is or what it can do. And power without understanding destroys everything it touches. As if summoned by the words, Celestine gasped, her hand going to her chest. The glow from the marks on her skin intensified, spreading up her legs, across her torso, down her arms. The remaining fabric of her gown began to smoke, the same way the hem had burned, and Elias moved toward her instinctively. Celestine, look at me. Breathe. You're okay. But she wasn't okay. Her eyes, when they met his, were wide with panic and filled with golden light. I can feel it, Elias. Something waking up inside me. Something huge and angry, and it wants out. I don't know how to stop it. The windows began to rattle. The fire in the hearth flared higher. And Morgana's voice cut through the chaos, sharp with urgency. You need to leave, both of you. If the power fully manifests here, my house won't contain it. Go somewhere open, somewhere the damage can be controlled. Go now, but it was already too late. The gown disintegrated completely, falling away in ashes, and Celestine stood there clothed only in golden light, covered head to toe in glowing symbols, her body shaking with power she'd never asked for and didn't know how to control. And in her eyes, Elias saw the terrified girl he'd fallen in love with drowning in the legacy of a curse that had been waiting 100 years to finally break free. The power exploded outward from Celestine like a shockwave, invisible but undeniable, shattering every window in Morgana's house simultaneously and sending books flying from their shelves like startled birds. Elias felt it wash over him, a pressure against his chest that made his heart stutter, made his lungs forget how to pull air, made every nerve in his body scream that he was standing in the presence of something vast and ancient and absolutely not meant for the modern world. But he didn't move away. He stepped closer, his hands reaching for Celestine even as Morgana shouted at him to get back, to give her space, to let the power burn itself out. He couldn't. He wouldn't. Because beneath the golden light and the terrifying magic and the symbols that crawled across her skin like living things, he could see Celestine's face, could see the absolute terror in her eyes, could see that she was drowning in herself and desperately needed an anchor to hold on to. His hands found her shoulders, and the moment he touched her, the power surged through him like lightning, white-hot and overwhelming, showing him things he couldn't possibly know and shouldn't be able to see. He saw Alara Ashford being dragged through the streets of old Ashford City, saw the hatred in the faces of people who had been her neighbors, saw Harrison Harrington watching from a window with satisfaction cold as winter on his face. He saw Celestine's parents on that bridge, saw the moment their car went over the railing, saw 7-year-old Celestine screaming in the back seat as water rushed in through broken windows. He saw Morgana standing in Eleanor Harrington's study, accepting money and instructions and the weight of a lie she would carry for decades. He saw generations of Ashford children born with marks on their skin that their parents tried desperately to hide, saw the curse passing through bloodlines like a genetic mutation, waiting, always waiting for the right conditions to activate. And he saw Celestine, his Celestine, growing up in a cage made of silk and symbols, growing up believing she was being protected when she was being suppressed, growing up alone and afraid and convinced that something was wrong with her when the only thing wrong was that powerful people had decided her freedom was less important than their security. The visions released him as suddenly as they'd grabbed him, and he stumbled backward, gasping, his hands still on Celestine's shoulders, his eyes meeting hers. I saw, he said, his voice raw. I saw everything. What they did to your family, what they did to you. Celestine, I'm so sorry. I'm so desperately sorry. The golden light surrounding her flickered, dimming slightly as tears began to stream down her face. I don't want this power, she sobbed. I don't want to be a curse or a weapon or a test. I just want to be me. I just want to be normal. Elias pulled her against his chest, feeling the power crackling between them, but refusing to let go. You are you. This thing that's happening, it doesn't change who you are at heart. You're still the woman who teaches children to find their voices through art. You're still the person who reads to elderly patrons at the library. You're still Celestine, And nothing, not curses or magic or century-old grudges, can take that away unless you let it. Morgana's voice cut through the moment, urgent and afraid. This is beautiful, truly, but we have a more immediate problem. The seals are completely broken now, and Celestine's power is fully awake. Until she learns to control it, she's dangerous to herself and everyone around her. We need to get her somewhere safe, somewhere she can't accidentally hurt people. Before anyone could respond, before they could even process what Morgana was suggesting, the front door of the house exploded inward. Not from Celestine's power, but from something else, from people forcing their way inside with violence and purpose. Men in dark suits poured through the broken doorway, professional and cold-eyed. And at their head was a woman Elias recognized with a shock that felt like betrayal carved into his bones. Amara. His sister stood in the ruined doorway wearing an expression he'd never seen on her face before, hard and determined, and absolutely devoid of the warmth that usually lived in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Elias," she said, and she sounded like she meant it even as the men with her moved to surround them. "But I can't let you destroy everything our family built. Grandmother told me everything before she died, made me swear to protect the Harrington legacy no matter what the cost. When I realized you were falling for the Ashford girl, when I understood what was happening, I knew I had to act." Elias felt the world tilt sideways, felt betrayal and fury and disbelief war in his chest. "Amara, what have you done? What are you doing?" She gestured to the men, who began to move towards Celestine with the coordinated efficiency of people who had practiced this. What grandmother should have done from the beginning. "The curse says the Harrington heir has to choose between love and power, between the girl and the empire. Well, I'm making the choice for you, brother. I'm choosing our family." One of the men reached for Celestine, his hand closing around her arm, and everything went white. The power that had been flickering uncertainly around Celestine suddenly exploded with a force that was no longer confused or afraid, but absolutely, coldly furious. The man who had touched her flew backward as if struck by an invisible fist, his body hitting the wall hard enough to crack plaster and leave him slumped unconscious on the floor. The other men froze, suddenly understanding that they were not dealing with a frightened girl, but with something that could end them without effort. Celestine pulled away from Elias, standing alone in the center of the ruined room, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the past and present and future, all speaking together. "You want to make choices for me? You want to decide my fate like I'm a piece on a board game? Like I'm a problem to be solved or a threat to be contained?" Her eyes, blazing gold, fixed on Amara. "I have spent 17 years being controlled. 17 years being told what to wear, how to live, who to be. 17 years as a prisoner in a cage I didn't even know existed. And now you think you can just walk in here and take away the one thing, the one person, who makes me feel human." The golden symbols covering her skin began to pulse in rhythm with her words. "I could destroy you. All of you. I can feel it, the power running through me, showing me how. I could bring every Harrington building crashing down. I could erase your family name from every document, every deed, every record. I could make it like the Harringtons never existed." Elias saw Amara's face go pale, saw real fear enter her eyes for the first time in her life. But before his sister could speak, before anyone could move, Elias stepped between them. "Celestine, stop. Please." She turned those burning gold eyes on him, and for a heartbeat, he wasn't sure she recognized him. Then something shifted, some flicker of the woman he knew pushing through the power and the rage. "Elias, move. They're trying to take you from me. They're trying to force you to choose their empire over us." He held his ground, his voice steady despite the fear, making his heart race. "No one can force me to choose anything. My choice is already made. It's been made since the night I met you. I choose you, Celestine. I choose you over the company, over the legacy, over every dollar and every building and every bit of power my family has accumulated through theft and lies. None of it matters if I lose you." The golden light around her flickered, uncertainty creeping back in. "But if you choose me, you lose everything. Your family, your position, your future. The curse demands it, and I won't. I can't be the reason you're destroyed." Elias moved closer, close enough to feel the power radiating off her skin. close enough to see the tears cutting tracks through the golden glow on her face. You're not destroying me. You're saving me from becoming everything I never wanted to be, from perpetuating a legacy built on hurting people like you. The curse isn't punishment, Celestine. It's liberation disguised as loss. Behind him, Morgana's voice carried quiet authority. He's right, child. The curse was never about destruction. Alara didn't want revenge, she wanted justice. She wanted the Harringtons to understand what they'd taken, what they'd destroyed, and she wanted to give them a choice their ancestor never gave her. Love or power, truth or lies. The person standing in front of you, or the empire built on stolen foundations. Celestine looked between Elias and Morgana, the power still crackling around her, but no longer threatening to explode outward. And if Elias chooses me, if he gives up everything, the curse breaks? We're both free. Morgana nodded. The curse breaks. The power inside you becomes yours to control rather than something controlling you. And both bloodlines can finally move forward without the weight of the past crushing them. Amara's voice cut in, sharp with desperation. Elias, you can't be seriously considering this. Our family, our company, everything grandfather and grandmother and father built. You'd throw it all away for a girl you've known for 6 months? Elias turned to look at his sister, and his voice when he spoke was gentle but absolutely firm. I'm not throwing anything away, Amara. I'm returning what was never ours to keep. And yes, I'm choosing the woman I love over an empire we built on someone else's ruin. If that makes me a fool in your eyes, then I'll be a fool. But at least I'll be free. He turned back to Celestine, reaching out his hand to her. Whatever happens next, we face it together. No more secrets, no more separation, no more cages. I'm choosing you, Celestine Ashford. I'm choosing us. For a long moment, Celestine stood there, power blazing around her, the weight of a century-old curse and 17 years of suppression and a choice that would define both their futures pressing down on her shoulders. Then, slowly, the golden light began to dim, not extinguishing but pulling inward, sinking beneath her skin, settling into something that looked less like wild magic and more like potential waiting to be understood. The symbols on her skin remained, but they stopped pulsing, stopped moving, becoming beautiful tattoos rather than burning brands. When she placed her hand in Elias's, her fingers were warm and human and trembling with exhaustion and relief and something that might have been hope. Together, she whispered. No more cages. The moment their hands joined, something shifted in the air, a pressure releasing like a storm finally breaking. Morgana gasped, pressing her hand to her chest. The curse, she breathed. I can feel it. It's changing, transforming. Elias's choice, your acceptance, it's rewriting the prophecy. But before anyone could celebrate, before relief could fully settle in, Morgana's expression shifted to something darker. But there's something else. Something I never told you because I didn't know it myself until this moment. The curse had layers, protections, fail-safes Alara built in to make sure it couldn't be circumvented. Her eyes met theirs, filled with a sorrow that seemed to age her decades in seconds. You've broken the first layer. You've passed the test of choosing love over power. But that only begins the process. Celestine, you still need to learn to control what's inside you. And until you do, until you can master the power rather than letting it master you, you're a danger to everyone you love, especially to Elias. The words fell like stones. What are you saying? Celestine asked, her voice small. Morgana's expression was gentle but unyielding. I'm saying you need to leave. Both of you need time apart while you learn what you are and what you can do. There are places, old places, where people like you can train. I have contacts. But it will take time, possibly years. And Elias, while she's gone, you have work to do as well. Dismantling an empire built on theft and transforming it into something that serves justice, that doesn't happen overnight. Celestine's hand tightened on Elias's. No, I just found him. I just got free. I won't lose him now. But Elias, seeing the truth in Morgana's words even as they broke his heart, gently turned Celestine to face him. We're not losing each other. We're choosing each other so completely that we're willing to do the hard work of becoming people who can build a life together without destroying ourselves or others in the process. You go, you learn to control your power. I stay, I transform what the Harringtons have built. And when you come back, when you're ready, we start fresh. We start free. Through tears, through heartbreak, through the ruins of Morgana's house and the shattered remains of the lies they'd both been living. Celestine nodded. And 3 days later, she left. 3 years is a long time to live with absence carved into your chest like a wound that refuses to heal. Elias learned to function around it. Learned to wake up each morning without her beside him. Learned to walk through a city transformed by the choices they'd made together. Learned to read her letters when they came, brief and careful and never frequent enough, telling him she was learning, growing, becoming someone who could hold power without being consumed by it. But learning to function around absence wasn't the same as filling the space it left behind. And there were nights when Elias stood in the garden where Celestine's gown had first caught fire and wondered if he'd made the right choice. If letting her go had been wisdom or cowardice. If she would even recognize what he'd built in her absence. The city certainly didn't recognize it. The Ashford city that Celestine had left 3 years ago was not the same place she would return to, and Elias had made sure of that with every decision, every press conference, every restructuring that sent shockwaves through the business community and made the Harrington name something that inspired conversation rather than automatic respect. The first thing he'd done, 2 weeks after Celestine left, was call a board meeting at Harrington Holdings and present them with documents that proved beyond question how Harrison Harrington had stolen the Ashford lands a century ago. The board had stared at him like he'd lost his mind when he announced his intention to establish the Ashford Restoration Foundation and transfer 30% of company assets into it as reparations for historical injustice. "You'll destroy us," the chief financial officer had said, his face red with fury. "Shareholders will revolt. Our stock price will crater. You're committing corporate suicide." Elias had looked at each of them calmly and said words he'd practiced alone in his office the night before. "Then let it crater. Let shareholders revolt. I would rather lead a smaller company built on honesty than an empire founded on theft. My ancestors stole from the Ashford family, used false accusations and corrupt judges to destroy them, and we've been profiting from that crime for 5 generations. That ends now. Anyone who can't support this decision is welcome to resign." Half the board had walked out that day. The stock price did crater, dropping 40% in a single week as investors panicked and analysts declared the Harrington empire in freefall. But something unexpected happened in the wreckage. Smaller investors, individuals rather than institutional funds, started buying shares. Community organizations praised the foundation. Younger employees, the ones who had been quietly uncomfortable with the company's ruthless reputation, became fierce advocates for the changes. And slowly, painfully, like a bone setting after a break, the company began to transform into something that actually deserved respect rather than just commanded it through wealth and power. Amara had watched it all happen with an expression that cycled through fury, disbelief, and finally something that looked like reluctant admiration. She'd voted against him in the emergency board meeting 6 months later when directors who still clung to the old ways tried to have him removed as CEO. When the vote went against him anyway, and Elias found himself stripped of his title and executive authority, Amara had stood up in that boardroom and delivered a resignation speech that became local legend. "My brother is the best man I know," she'd said, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. "And you just fired him for having the courage to tell the truth and pay our family's debts. I won't work for a company run by cowards." She'd walked out that day, and 3 months later, she and Elias had founded Ashford Harrington Development, a new company dedicated to ethical real estate practices and community-focused projects. The years that followed were brutal and beautiful in equal measure. Brutal because building something honest from the ground up was infinitely harder than maintaining an empire built on convenient lies. Beautiful because for the first time in his life, Elias went to sleep each night knowing that his work had helped rather than hurt, that the buildings bearing his name were wanted by the communities they served rather than imposed on neighborhoods that had no choice. He worked 80-hour weeks, poured his grief and longing into creating something Celestine would be proud of, and tried not to count the days since she'd left even though he knew the exact number without having to check. 1,095 days. 3 years. And then, on an autumn evening when the air smelled of wood smoke and possibility, when the leaves in Riverside Park were turning the same colors they'd been the night Celestine's world had shattered and reformed, Elias was walking past the fountain where he'd proposed the Ashford Memorial 3 years ago, and he saw her. Time stopped. The entire city seemed to hold its breath. She stood by the fountain wearing a simple dress, not one of the elaborate gowns, but a knee-length sundress the color of twilight, her hair longer than he remembered, her face more mature, but still unmistakably hers. The symbols were still visible on her skin. He could see them tracing up her arms and disappearing beneath the dress's neckline. But they looked different now, settled and intentional rather than burning and wild. She looked peaceful in a way she never had before, looked like someone who had fought a war with herself and won, looked like coming home. Their eyes met across the distance, and the smile that broke across her face was sunlight after years of winter. Elias didn't remember deciding to run. His body simply moved, closing the space between them at a sprint that would have embarrassed him if he'd had any room in his chest for anything other than desperate, overwhelming relief. She ran too, and when they collided in the middle of the path, when he caught her in his arms and lifted her off her feet and spun her around while she laughed with pure joy, Elias felt pieces of himself that had been scattered for 3 years suddenly click back into alignment. "You came back," he said when he finally set her down, his hands framing her face like he was afraid she might disappear if he stopped touching her. "You really came back." Celestine's eyes were bright with tears that spilled over when she smiled. "I promised you I would. And I heard about everything you've done, everything you've built. Elias, I've been following the news, reading about the foundation and the new company and the way you've transformed what the Harrington name means in this city. I'm so incredibly proud of you." He kissed her then, 3 years of longing and love and faith that she would return pouring into that kiss. And she kissed him back with equal intensity, her arms tight around his neck, her body pressed against his like she was trying to memorize the feeling of being held by him again. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and grinning like teenagers, Elias asked the question that had been burning in him from the moment he saw her. "Are you staying? Please tell me you're staying this time." Celestine's smile was radiant and absolutely certain. "I'm staying. I've learned to control the power. I know what I am now, what the symbols mean, how to use what's inside me without letting it use me. I'm not afraid anymore, Elias. I'm ready to build a life here, a real life with you. If you'll still have me after 3 years apart." Elias laughed, the sound carrying pure relief and joy that echoed across the park. "If I'll still have you? Celestine, I've been waiting 3 years. I'd have waited 30 if that's what it took. You're it for me. You were always it." They walked together as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, hands intertwined, talking over each other in their eagerness to share 3 years of experiences compressed into minutes. Celestine told him about the sanctuary in the mountains where she'd trained, about learning to read the symbols on her skin like a language, about discovering that Alara's curse hadn't just been about destruction, but about transformation, about giving Ashford descendants the power to protect themselves and demand justice rather than beg for it. Elias told her about the Foundation's work, about the community centers they'd built on land that had once been Ashford property, about the scholarships established in Alara's name, about his sister's surprising transformation from corporate warrior to ethical business advocate. They made plans, tentative and excited, about the future they could finally build together without curses or secrets standing between them. And they might have walked and talked until dawn, might have tried to compress 3 years of separation into a single perfect evening. Except that as they passed beneath the old oak tree at the edge of the park, the tree where couples carved their initials and children climbed in summer, a figure stepped out from the shadows and made both of them freeze in their tracks. Morgana, but wrong. Changed in ways that made Elias's breath catch in his throat. The silver-haired woman who had carried guilt and secrets for decades looked diminished, her frame thinner than seemed possible, her skin pale as paper, her eyes still sharp, but burning with something that looked like borrowed time running out. She should have been dead. The cancer that had been killing her 3 years ago should have taken her within months. Yet here she stood, leaning heavily on a cane that looked older than the city itself, her breathing labored, but her gaze as penetrating as ever. "I'm glad you found each other again," Morgana said, her voice carrying the rasp of someone speaking past pain. "You've both done remarkably well. Better than I dared hope when I sent you away, Celestine. Better than I deserved after the lies I told and the choices I made." Celestine moved toward her, concern overriding the joy of reunion. "Morgana, you should be in a hospital. You shouldn't be out here alone. Let us help you." The older woman shook her head slowly, the movement seeming to cost her significant effort. "I don't have time for hospitals, child. Days, maybe hours if I'm unlucky. But I needed to see you both before the end. I needed to give you one final warning, one last piece of truth I've been carrying like a stone in my chest." The happiness that had been glowing in Elias's heart dimmed, replaced by creeping dread. Warning about what? We broke the curse. Celestine learned to control her power. We chose each other. What else is there? Morgana's expression crumbled for just a moment, revealing depths of sorrow that made her look ancient beyond her years. "The curse you broke was real," she said quietly. "Choosing love over power, returning what was stolen, learning to master the gift in your blood rather than being mastered by it. All of that was necessary and true. But it was only the first layer. Only the test that Alara built into the prophecy to see if the Harrington line could be redeemed and the Ashford line could be freed." Celestine's hand tightened on Elias's, and he felt her begin to tremble. "What do you mean, first layer?" Morgana's eyes, glittering with knowledge and regret, moved between them. Alara was brilliant and broken and absolutely committed to justice. She didn't just curse the Harringtons with a test they could pass through love and sacrifice. She built contingencies, protections, fail-safes to ensure that if the curse was broken, if the bloodlines united and the stolen power was returned, there would still be a reckoning for the original crime. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves overhead with a sound like whispers in a language neither Elias nor Celestine could understand. Morgana's form seemed to waver slightly, as if she were becoming translucent, as if the effort of standing and speaking was literally consuming what little life she had left. What Alara whispered with her dying breath, what even Eleanor never knew about, what I only discovered in the final stages of this disease when the morphine made the boundaries between worlds thin enough to see through, was the second part of her curse. Celestine's voice was barely audible. "What second part?" Morgana looked directly at her, and tears finally spilled down the older woman's gaunt cheeks. She said, "When the curse breaks and the bloodlines unite, when love conquers theft and power bows to justice, the old debts will still remain. Someone must pay them. The stolen must be returned not just in wealth, but in life. And the payment will come due when the united bloodlines bear fruit." The words landed like hammer blows. Elias felt his mind racing, trying to parse what Morgana was saying, trying to understand what payment will come due meant in the context of curses and prophecies and century-old vengeance. "You're saying there's another curse? Another test?" Morgana shook her head, and the movement seemed to drain the last of her strength. She leaned more heavily on her cane, her breathing becoming shallow and labored. "Not a test. A price. The Harringtons took life from the Ashfords, Alara's life, her children's futures, generations of potential snuffed out by greed and false accusations. The first curse allowed redemption through choice. The second curse demands payment through sacrifice." Celestine made a sound like she'd been struck. "What kind of sacrifice?" But Morgana's form was fading now, actually becoming transparent, and her voice, when it came, seemed to echo from very far away. "I don't know the specifics, child. I only know that when you and Elias have a child, when the Ashford and Harrington bloodlines truly unite, the second curse will activate. The debt will come due, and someone will have to pay it." Her eyes, the last solid thing about her fading form, fixed on them with desperate intensity. "I'm sorry. I thought breaking the first curse would be enough. I thought love and justice would satisfy the prophecy. But Alara's pain went deeper than I understood, and her curse has roots that go farther than I could see. Be careful. Be vigilant. And whatever happens, remember that curses feed on fear and division. Stay together. Trust each other. That's the only advice I can give you now." And then she was gone, not walking away but simply ceasing to exist, her form dissolving into mist that the wind scattered across the darkening park, leaving only the echo of her final words hanging in the cooling air. Elias and Celestine stood frozen, hands clasped so tightly their fingers ached, staring at the empty space where Morgana had stood. Around them, the city continued its evening routine, oblivious to the fact that a prophecy had just been rewritten and a new threat had emerged from the shadows of history. The future they had been planning, the life they had been imagining, the children they might someday have, All of it was suddenly shadowed by the promise of a debt they didn't know how to pay and a curse they didn't know how to break. But when Celestine looked up at Elias, when their eyes met in the gathering darkness, her expression was not one of fear, but of determination. "Whatever comes," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "we face it together. No more secrets. No more running. No more letting the past dictate our future. We've beaten one curse. We can handle whatever else Alara left behind." Elias pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her as if he could shield her from prophecies and debts and the weight of crimes committed a century before they were born. "Together," he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "Always together." And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, as the city lights began to flicker on around them, they stood there in Riverside Park, two people bound by love and bloodline and a curse that had transformed from test to threat, ready to face whatever the second prophecy would demand. Because some stories don't end when the first curse breaks. Some stories are only just beginning. And somewhere in the space between worlds, in the place where the dead watch the living and old debts wait patiently to be paid, Alara Ashford's spirit smiled. Not with cruelty, but with the grim satisfaction of someone who had planted seeds a century ago and was finally watching them bear fruit, bitter and sweet in equal measure, exactly as she had always intended. And so we reach the end of this chapter in Celestine and Elias's story, though as we've learned, endings are rarely final when curses run deep and justice demands more than good intentions. This tale reminds us of profound truths we often forget in our comfortable lives. First, that the sins of previous generations don't simply disappear because time passes, they echo forward, shaping lives that never chose to be part of ancient conflicts. Second, that real love isn't just about the beautiful moments of reunion and romance. It's about choosing to stand together even when new threats emerge from shadows you thought you'd already conquered. And third, perhaps most importantly, that breaking free from one cage doesn't mean you're finally free. Sometimes it just means you've graduated to fighting bigger battles that require everything you've learned along the way. Celestine thought the gowns were her only prison, then discovered her entire childhood was built on lies, and now faces the possibility that even her future children might be caught in a web of ancestral debts she never asked to inherit. Elias gave up his empire for love, transformed his family's legacy, and now discovers that sacrifice wasn't the end of the story, but merely the price of admission to the next challenge. The real lesson here isn't that love conquers all. It's that love gives us the strength to face all when it comes for us, which it inevitably will. You've got this, whatever curse or challenge or inherited burden you're carrying. It's okay to feel overwhelmed when you realize that solving one problem just revealed a deeper one. It's okay to be afraid of what the future might demand from you. What matters is that you don't face it alone, that you find people who will stand with you even when the path ahead is unclear and the cost is unknown, that you keep choosing truth and justice and love even when they're harder than lies and convenience and isolation. Thank you so much for joining us on Tales Methlyn today. If this story made you think about the legacies we inherit and the futures we create, if it reminded you that no battle is truly over until every layer of injustice is addressed, then please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel so you never miss a tale that challenges and inspires. Share this with someone who needs to know that their struggles matter even when they seem never-ending. And drop a comment below telling us what you think that second curse might demand and how Celestine and Elias should prepare for it. Until next time, remember that your story is still being written, the pen is in your hand, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is keep writing even when you don't know how the next chapter will end. Stay strong, stay together,